Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to part 2 of Smashed Idols, an investigation into archaeological evidence in favor of the Exodus. As I mentioned last week, and Ellie, you really highlighted this with the comment that you made, it's just so discouraging to hear people talk about that archaeology does not prove the Exodus. The Exodus couldn't have happened. Why isn't it in the archaeological record? Now, listen, at the end of the day, we're persons of faith, but still, it can be discouraging and upsetting. I'm going to present, as we did last time, I'm going to present some new evidence. Last time we showed that the dating of the Exodus matches up exactly with the way that the rabbis have it based on internal evidence from the text. This evening, we're going to use some internal evidence from the text and some logic and probably go where no one's ever gone before, but with some very, very fascinating, I think you'll find fascinating evidence in favor of the proposal that I'm going to make this evening. Let's just back up and start with a little bit of a review of some of the geography, which is very, very important for our purposes, some of the geography that's involved in understanding the story of the Exodus. And I want to also ask everyone to keep in mind that as we think about the story of the Exodus, it is important and worthwhile to keep in mind that generally speaking, the rabbis of the Talmud, the rabbis of the written record that we have were not tremendous, and certainly in the case of commentators who lived in Europe, like Rashi, etc., did not have any grasp, or certainly not a firm grasp, of the geography, let alone the political organization of Egypt. And that's going to become significant in our story, as we'll see. Let me take you back first. I'm going to share the screen with you, and we're going to start by looking again at a map. Now, what we're looking here at the map is called Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt is the part that's closer to the Mediterranean Sea. Upper Egypt is the part that's further. So even though Lower Egypt is to the north, don't get confused. Anyway, it's not important. We're just looking now at a small part. We'll look at the larger picture of Egypt momentarily, but we're looking at a small part. And the area which is most important to point out to you is this one here that I'm circling right now. And the reason why this is important is in the upper right-hand corner, you see Tanis and Avaris. Avaris was the home of, or the capital, I should say, of the Hyksos pharaohs, the kings of Egypt that had invaded from Canaan. And it is these kings and these Hyksos to which Joseph became vizier, and eventually the Jewish people blossomed in this area. Joseph invited his family to live near him, so they lived near Avaris. And this is an area here that I'm circling, kind of like 19 and 20 here, is Goshen. Goshen was a very fertile area. It was an area where one could shepherd, and our forefathers were shepherds. So it was a particularly advantageous area, but most importantly, it was very close to Joseph, and Joseph could take careful care of his family by being in Avaris and having them living in Goshen. Now, this map shows you the entire extent of Egypt. On the previous map, the furthest south we get is over here, Heracleopolis. I don't know if that's exactly matched up here, but that's more or less about here, where Memphis is. So if you see Memphis over here, not Tennessee, Memphis, Egypt, south of Cairo, okay, you can see that Egypt is much, much larger than this area here that we were looking at on the previous map. As a matter of fact, if you go down, it keeps going, right? You've heard of the Aswan Dam, perhaps. Okay, Edfu, these were all parts of the Egyptian realm, all the way at the bottom of the Red Sea. This is the Red Sea over here. All right, we'll get, we might get another look at another map later. I want to point out in particular Karnak over here. Karnak, Karnak is a location that we're going to pay attention to a little bit later as well, but it is way, way, way south. The reason why Karnak is significant, and let me just shrink this. Oh, there we go. The reason why Karnak is significant is that along with a short while where there were pharaohs living in Egypt, Karnak was the center of Egyptian power most frequently during the time that the Jewish people were in the land of Egypt. Karnak is 750 kilometers from Avaris and Tanis, which means it's not a walkable distance. As a matter of fact, the closest that any king sat to Goshen was when there was a king in Memphis. Memphis is 135 kilometers, or at least according to Google, a 28-hour walk from Tanis and Avaris. This is significant because in our story in Shemos, we are told that Moses went to the king, Moses went to Pharaoh, and he came back, and on his way out, and then he went in, and he came back and forth. The problem in the narrative is that that's pretty impractical. Even if the king is in Memphis, that's impractical, let alone if the king is all the way in Karnak, which is 3 times further down the river. So again, I'm just pointing out this geography. The other important thing about the geography here comes to us via a verse in Psalms, which we pointed out last time. And this verse in Psalms, hold on, please. Okay. This verse in Psalms is talking about that the Jewish people did not remember God's strength on the day he redeemed them from the foe in Egypt, how he displayed his signs in Egypt, his wonders in the plain of Tsoan. The place where the wonders of Moses performed the wonders of God was in the plains of Tsoan. Tsoan is Tanis. The Torah is, well, I shouldn't say the Torah is clear, but based on the geography, just to go back to our clearer map here, right? The Jews are living in the Avaris area, a little south and in from Avaris in Goshen, okay? Moses performs his wonders in Tanis. The problem textually with that is the king of Egypt was nowhere near Tanis. Again, the closest that you get is Memphis, which is already impractical in the telling of the story, let alone if the king was in Karnak. So these are just geographical facts that we're going to have to grapple with. I do want to point out that along with the capital being where we've said, I should point out that, and again, we have to go back to this map, but when you make your way down to Thebes in the south, Thebes was a location that is also, it's synonymous with Luxor, Luxor, and the famous Ramesseum. These are the great temples of the kings of Egypt, were located all the way to the south in Karnak and in Thebes. In that area was where the greatest temples of the kings who were ruling at the time that the Jews were in Goshen. So again, our geography, Tanis is the place where the wonders were performed, yet it is very far from Memphis and really impossibly far from Karnak. And it's worthwhile to keep in mind that Karnak is also synonymous with the great temples at Luxor and Ramesseum. We'll come back to those temples a little bit later. Okay. Here is one more look at ancient Egypt, just to give you an idea of the scale that we're talking about. Luxor is over in this region here, right in the middle. The green is the Nile, or the Nile Valley, and the Egyptians at the time of the Exodus were almost certainly in possession of Kush all the way to the south, and obviously all the way to the north and into the Delta. Just to give you an idea of the scale of how long it would take to walk from one place to another, in order to get from Tanis to Luxor would be the equivalent, if you look on the map, it's pretty much the equivalent of walking from, let's say, Jerusalem, just to be kind, all the way to the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. Certainly not something that people were doing day in and day out, back and forth and back and forth. Doesn't seem to hold up well. And again, even if it's Memphis, you're talking about the distance essentially from the Mediterranean Sea to, from the Mediterranean Sea almost to the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. These are our geographical facts that we have to sort of grapple with here. Okay, let me pause. I'm going to stop sharing and just ask if there are anybody who has a question. I just want to make sure I can see everybody. Ellie, go ahead.
Can you just cite for me where you get the reference that the miracles happened in Tanis?
Yes. So we have to go back to the verse. The verse in Psalm says that the wonders were performed in sedate Soan, in the fields of Soan. Soan is Tanis. That's not disputable. Everybody knows. That's sort of like a given that Soan is Tanis. That's just an archaeological fact.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Mark, we'll come to you next, Paul. Mark, hold on. You're going to have to unmute. Go ahead.
Unmute. Where are some of the large pyramids in Egypt and the and some of those things that are still in existence?
Okay, so let me share the map with you again, and you'll be able to see where that is. That is not what I wanted. Okay, is everyone looking? Are you looking at the map now? You're looking at the map, correct?
Yes.
Okay, let me go back to the map now with, here. Giza is right near Memphis. You see it here? Pyramid of Giza, the pyramid south of Saqqara. These are where the major pyramids are. The pyramids of Giza are here opposite Cairo, close to Memphis and pretty far still from Tanis, well over 100 kilometers from Tanis. Okay. Paul Chayton is on next. Paul, you're going to have to unmute yourself. Something should pop up on your screen, Paul, giving you an opportunity to unmute yourself.
The right-hand corner.
Try the upper right-hand corner.
And his is going to be upper left-hand corner.
Or upper left-hand corner, upper corner, one way or another.
Up here, Paul.
Left-hand corner.
Not getting you. Hold on. I can't forcibly unmute you.
Okay.
There we go. I got you, Paul. Go ahead.
All right, was the Nile River navigable at the time?
Yes.
Yes.
So why
Yes,
couldn't the
It
trips
wasn't
be
in
made
its
by
exact
boat?
course where it is now, but it was navigable. I'm sorry, say again.
So why couldn't the trips be made by boat?
Okay. Well, first of all, there's nothing in the text that indicates that anybody took any boats. Like,
But there's nothing in the
Yes,
text that
it
says
says-
he walked.
oh, it does. It does. Says he was going in, he was coming out. He met people on his way in and out. The text clearly implies that they're going on the ground. So I can't tell you how long it would take. It would still, navigating down to Luxor, navigating down to Karnak still would have been out of range.
Days.
Maybe you could say if the king was sitting in Memphis, which by the way, only one king was. But the text really sounds like they're just walking everywhere that they're going. It's very difficult to say otherwise. It also in the text really sounds like Pharaoh was right there in Goshen. But again, you can read through the text, especially the first few chapters of Exodus. I think that you'll find that what I'm saying is well supported.
Rabbi, if I can interject for a moment,
Yes, please.
I spent 2 weeks in Egypt, and I've traveled literally the whole country in the Nile. The Nile is Egypt. And any way that you go down to Luxor and Karnak and the Valley of the Kings, even in the dead of winter, you're hitting 80, 90 degrees. We were there right after Sukkot, and we did all of our travel at 6 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock in the morning, and then again in the evening. You could not do anything during the day. It was so hot. So you can imagine what it was in those days. So it would be an impossibility. And the Valley of the Kings is full of tombs. You crawl into these tombs and literally see the mummies that are there.
Yeah.
The entire pyramids are built primarily in the north, what we call, let's call it the south, okay? Which is the reverse.
Yeah.
Of the Nile River flowing from north to south. But the pyramids are all right outside of Cairo.
The big ones, the ones that we know.
The big ones.
The big ones.
Right.
They're actually pyramids scattered throughout the country, but yeah, the
And
big ones are there.
And I'm trying to think of it, the carvings, the main carvings that were in Aswan that are now in Abu Simbel
Yeah.
were moved when the Aswan Dam was built. So you got to realize that what you're talking about is a huge distance. Even today, I was there 25, 30 years ago, but there's nothing there. You go 1 mile either side of the Nile River Basin, there is nothing there.
Right. Except for in the Delta.
You couldn't live there.
It's
You could not exist.
Yep.
Even today, you could not exist.
Yep.
Everything is based upon the Nile and what the Nile provides in terms of fertility and in terms of fish.
right.
That's where it's at.
Yep.
And it's very, very fascinating to visit. But I would tell you that the part closest to the Mediterranean is where all of the civilization really is.
Right.
In the other end.
Right. Okay. Esther? Proposal I'm about to make to you, I think, again, reads well into the story, even though it's something most of us have not heard of, and it answers some very, very important questions. And to appreciate it or to understand it, we have to start by understanding how it is that government was organized in the Middle Kingdoms, which is more or less the time period we're talking about, how government was organized in Egypt during that time period. So let me share my screen with you again, just to be able to read a little something to you about that. No, that's not the screen I want. There we go. So amongst the things to be aware of when it comes to Egypt at that time was the state central administrative machinery. I'm just going to read it to you. State central administrative machinery comprised a number of large departments assigned all administrative functions of the state, including the king's house, with branches in every province responsible for the state administrative services. So each nome in Egypt had its own seat of power, had its own seat where it functioned on behalf of the central government, not dissimilar to, I guess, the way every country is more or less set up, where you have a local administration that handles things. The local administration in the 19th nome was located in Tanis. I'm going to propose to you, based on a number of facts, that the person identified as Pharaoh in the Exodus story is overwhelmingly not the Pharaoh of the country, but the Pharaoh of the nome. And the reason why that's significant or important is because otherwise there are many things in the story that are difficult to understand. Not the least of which, as we've already said, is Moses going back and forth to talk to Pharaoh almost at times on a daily basis, but going back and forth to talk to Pharaoh is impractical in the story. But there are other problems. So Pharaoh says to his people, right, any male child, throw in the river. Okay, every male Jewish child, throw in the river. The problem with that is that for 95% of Egypt, there were no male babies to throw in, no Jewish male babies anyway, to throw in the river. Jews didn't live all over Egypt. They lived in a very, very specific region, which we call Goshen. For that matter, in terms of understanding the plagues, it's difficult to understand why it is that the entire country would be stricken with plagues when 95% of them never met a Jew in their life. It actually raises serious questions about the justice of God. Right? We're always asking, why is it, right? You hear this question all the time. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It's not fair that God Pharaoh's heart, right? All the Egyptians had to suffer and they had to suffer all these plagues. What did they do? The answer is most of them didn't do anything. Now, the Egyptians living in the Goshen region were clearly participants in the oppression of the Jews. Of this, there's no question. However, again, you're talking about 2 out of the 46, if I remember the number, or 42, 2 out of the 42 nomes of Egypt where Jews lived. The other 40 areas, there were no Jews. So what were those? Those people weren't oppressing anyone. So what I'd like to propose to you is as follows. The reason why we don't hear about the plagues in the archaeological record is because the plagues were a local phenomenon in the area where the Jews were being oppressed. They were not all over the country. We will see one exception to that shortly. But the plagues were a local phenomenon because, folks, if the plagues were over the entire country, there's no doubt that there would be records of them all over the country. Of course, this begs an important question, which we're going to answer momentarily. And that is, well, at least there should be some record of the plagues from the area where the Jews were being oppressed. And actually, we have a very clear understanding of why there is no record of that. And I'm going to share a video with you momentarily that explains it. So let me go to sharing screen. And there's a bit of a story behind this, which I'm looking forward to telling you. Okay. Actually, let me just add one other point first, a minor point. Okay. The Jews are commanded to take the Paschal lamb and we are told, for that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. I will mete out punishment to all the gods of Egypt, I the Lord. I just want to point out that it's a little bit strange that it says all the gods of Egypt. Why didn't it just say the gods of Egypt? What is it? All the gods of Egypt. Now, this type of derivation, by the way, is very, very common in the Talmud and in the Midrashic literature, this type of derivation. What is all the gods of Egypt? Okay, so we're going to hold that in mind, that when God strikes down the firstborn, he metes out punishment to all the gods of Egypt. All right, so now
bizarre location.
I'm going to share with you now a video from a gentleman known as Brian Forrester. Brian Forrester is an archaeologist, not a mainstream archaeologist, but a reputable archaeologist. And Brian Forrester, who I actually emailed in preparation for this class and got some important information. Brian Forrester has spent a lot of time on the ground in Egypt. And in this video, he shows evidence of massive ancient cataclysm at Tanis in the Nile Delta of Egypt. And what you're going to see in this video is what's left of Tanis. Remember that if there's anywhere where there's going to be records of this, since it's a local phenomenon, it's going to be in Tanis, Tanis being the seat of power in the area of Goshen. As we're about to see, there's not a whole lot left there to look at.
In my new book, Lost Ancient Technology of Egypt, Volume 2. Now, this strange location is called Tanis, and it's in the Nile Delta in northern Egypt. It takes 3.5 hours to drive from Cairo, and for the last 2 hours, we drive through lush vegetation and agricultural farmland. So the question is, why is Tanis seemingly devoid of life, and why is every sculpture and obelisk and pillar, etc., smashed to pieces? This is way beyond the damage of any marauding army or vandalism. This is cataclysmic destruction, and we're going to see lots of evidence of heat scorching on the surfaces of a lot of the stone. Now, most of the stone, which is located at Tanis, such as this, is granite, and it's likely that the granite came from the great quarry at Aswan, and Aswan is 1,000 kilometers to the south. So how was all of this transported? These are small pieces. Again, notice the very strange erosion of the surfaces. And the only piece that seems to have been intact is this quartzite box. The hieroglyphics were likely done by the dynastic Egyptians, but it's clear that the dynastic Egyptians found the site of Tanis in complete destruction, and so they decided to build there and recycle with what they found. Now again, is this erosion natural or normal, or could it be the result of intense blasts of heat? This gives you the visual. Again, you can see that Tanis is...
Okay, I just want to point out in this visual, right, for 2 hours, he's been driving through the Nile Delta. It's fertile, it's green everywhere, unless there are houses. It's green and fertile everywhere. Tanis is gone, it's just not there. It's this sand, which he's going to describe momentarily, isn't even like soil.
Is more or less devoid of life, except for the odd thorny bush, like the one you can see on the right here. And when you walk on the surface, it's not like you're walking in sand or on dirt, but more like flour, as if all of the nutrients was burnt out of the soil itself.
Now, let me point out, because we don't have time to watch the entire video now, let me point out that much of what was Tanis is 20 feet below the surface here. Tanis was basically wiped off the map, literally wiped off the map. The type of destruction of the ground is not a natural phenomenon. And for that matter, as he points out, and we're going to talk about again soon, as he points out, there is evidence that the granite blocks were essentially melted and eroded by intense heat. We're talking about thousands of degrees Celsius, nothing that human beings would come up with. If it was a local phenomenon, all of the local records would have been sitting in Tanis. And as you can see, there's no Tanis anymore. It was completely destroyed by a force which evidence indicates was able to apply heat in the thousands of degrees Celsius to the point where it could erode granite. This has all been, by the way, this has all been studied and has been confirmed by geologists as well. So for some reason, Tanis is gone. What might that reason be? I would propose to you that basically God leveled the place. And once the place was leveled, you're not going to find any evidence of, you're not going to have any of the local records, and therefore you're not going to have any evidence or any of the records of anything that was going on with the plagues and the destruction, because since it was a local phenomenon and this was the seat of power, this is where all the records would be. And the place is gone. Oddly enough, Tanis, which is the place where God performed God's miracles, the place where the Exodus went down, Tanis is supernaturally been wiped off the map. Now, you should know Tanis is not the only place that got wiped. Well, I shouldn't say got wiped off the map. Tanis is not the only place that was struck with this remarkable heat that damaged statues. I remind you that the great temples of the kings were located in Luxor, Ramesseum, Karnak. So let me share another video with you from our friend Brian Forrester. This one entitled, "Huge Statues Near Luxor in Egypt Show Signs of Cataclysmic Damage." We'll only watch another 2 minutes of this.
Hi, this is Brian Forster, and today we are in the area of the Valley of the Queens and the Valley of the Kings in ancient Thebes near Luxor in Egypt. And this is the Ramesseum. It's largely a dynastic Egyptian construction, but we'll see some anomalies here which date from pre-dynastic times. We know that because there are some very large statues and other features carved in very hard granite that show signs of catastrophic destruction. Now that is a kneecap from a massive granite statue that weighed originally 1,000 tons. And there you see in the background is the seated figure, and you see the 2 feet on the left-hand side and the massive base on which it once sat. This is the base itself, weighing in at approximately 400 tons. And this one giant block of stone, as well as the statue, the stone, as one granite, of course, came from the southernmost point of Egypt, the giant quarries at Aswan. And what we see here is strange deterioration of other blocks of granite. It appears as if the stone has been hit by very intense flashes of heat, and we believe that this happened approximately 12,000 years ago, solar plasma outbursts from the sun, as chronicled.
It's because you don't believe in the Bible.
Aftershock. Now, this is what is left of the giant statue. And again, what we're going to see is the stone is heavily cracked and is sloughing off. Granite does not normally break down in this manner. And all of this supposed or proposed heat damage is on the back of the statue and not on the front of the statue or the sides. And that tells us that this giant seated figure was originally looking towards the Valley of the Queens area and was struck from the back.
Okay. Here's what we have, ladies and gentlemen. I asked Brian Forrester to please tell me everywhere in Egypt where there was heat damage of this type. Those places are Karnak, Ramesseum, and Luxor, which was the seat of power and where the temples were, the great temples of the Egyptian kings, and Tanis. These are locations which were struck mysteriously by a heat source, which Brian Forrester can't ascribe to anything other than a proposal about solar flares, which seem to have really, really good aim. Uvechol Elohei Mitzrayim eseh shvatim. What God says is, listen, I'm not just going to kill the firstborn in Egypt. I'm going to settle the score with all the gods of Egypt, not just whatever local thing is standing around in Tanis, but God says, I am going to deliver destruction to all of the gods, the great gods of Egypt, which are in Luxor, Ramesseum, Karnak. That's where those great gods were. So even though the plagues were a local issue in Tanis, God evens the score, apparently. God evens the score not only with Tanis, but with the gods of Egypt in their seat of power of Egypt. So what I'm proposing to you basically is as follows. Moses is talking with the local pharaoh of the nome in which the Jews were living. Please keep in mind that the term pharaoh, as we saw last week, really is, I forget the fancy English word for it, right? But the word pharaoh is not a title or an independent word so much as a title. The word pharaoh basically means big house, right? So the big house, pharaoh was the big house. So he was the guy, whoever was in charge of the big house, they called him the pharaoh, but the word literally means the big house. Okay, so I would assume anyway, it's pretty reasonable to extend the term pharaoh, that the term pharaoh would have been used to describe in a lesser way the functionaries, the local functionaries who represented the central government. Now, the central government doesn't get off scot-clean here. We see that God delivers judgment to them as well. But again, my proposal to you is, and it works much better in the story, is that Moses is dealing with the local pharaoh, the local administrator in Tanis, and that when the story ends, Tanis is wiped off the map, is struck with a heat source which is inexplicable otherwise, and which is found in Egypt only in the great temples of the kings as well. And that this really reconstructs the story better, not only because of the geography, it fixes our geographical problems, but it also helps to explain why it is, or it helps to deal with the problem that Jews lived in a tiny portion of Egypt. Why was the entire country being punished? When in the end, if all the people that are being punished are the people living in that locale, the people who are oppressing them, that makes a lot more sense to us, right? That the oppressors themselves are the ones who were punished and stricken with the plagues, which is why you don't find a record of the plagues anywhere else, but you do find, you would have found a record of the plagues in Tanis if Tanis wasn't wiped off the map supernaturally. So what I'd like to propose to you is that the story that we have, that we're used to thinking that the big pharaoh and it's all of Egypt, et cetera, that interpretation and translation is perhaps inaccurate. And that really who Moses is dealing with is the local pharaoh of that region. No doubt the big pharaoh was in on the idea of oppressing the Jews as well and had some culpability, but that's not who Moses is going back and forth with. And that when we talk about the plagues in Egypt, we are talking specific, that the plague struck a very specific limited area, namely the area which had persons who were oppressing the Jewish people. As you read through the plagues, by the way, it says, God says, I will define, I'll make it very clear that it's that the Jews are being treated one way here and the Egyptians are being treated a different way here. Okay, well, you only have a comparison if Jews are living where the Egyptians and Jews, you can only compare the people who are living in the same place. So again, finally, and then I'll take questions. My proposal to you is that the reason why we have no archaeological evidence of the plagues is because that archaeological evidence was destroyed in Tanis. a place which clearly was leveled in a supernatural fashion thousands of years ago, and which shows evidence of not only that destruction, but heat scorching, sort of miraculous, certainly not natural or human heat scorching, which is also present at the great religious centers of Egypt from about the same time. I think the story reads much better that way. And I think it's always important, as you know, anybody who's been coming to my classes, I always want the story to read better. I think the story reads better this way. It explains important factors. And in the end, we do have archaeological evidence. Our archaeological evidence is the destruction of Tanis, which inexplicably is a wasteland in the middle of the Egyptian Delta, was the seat of power, was where we know that the miracles were done. And God took a couple of shots as well as at the great gods of Egypt when he struck down the firstborn as well. Okay, questions and comments. Welcome, Marty. You're up first. Paul, you're next.
We're dealing in a situation today with a coronavirus that knows no border. What determined the border for some of the plagues?
I would say, yeah.
Locusts.
I would say that border was determined by wherever it was that Jews were being oppressed.
Rabbi, it doesn't make logical sense.
Why?
Frogs knew where to stop. The locusts knew where to stop. Darkness knew where to stop.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
God himself says, I'll show you that I can make it stop wherever I want.
So now we're asked to believe that Hashem determined that it was going to stop at a certain point in the Nile Delta, where the Jews were no longer going to be there, and it would only afflict those people that were picking on the Jews.
Right.
Okay. All right. That's a little far-fetched when you really think about it.
It's certainly novel, but it fits the evidence. It fits the evidence better than the story that we generally hear.
I'm not questioning whether it fits the evidence or not.
It's novel, no question.
You know, it's like you're driving on a road and the sign says cattle crossing or deer crossing. Who told the deer and the cattle? I don't know who told them, but if they get in my way, what am I going to do about it?
I hit him.
It's very simple.
All right. Paul, you're up.
Yeah. Where's the bodies? Where's the bones?
Of the people who were
Where's the
killed in the
relics?
plagues?
There's no, it was cataclysmic, but yet there's no indication that there were people.
No people where?
In Panic. They destroyed
Canis?
Panic when they destroyed
Listen,
it.
you know,
There has to
I
be
would,
some
I
indication
would
that
guess,
there's bodies.
I would guess that if you apply thousands of degrees of heat Celsius, you're not going to be left with very much of anything other than granite. Not going to be left with much of anything, and deteriorated granite as well. The people be gone, or dead and buried, or decomposed.
I thought Rabbi stopped working.
He can hear, I'm not on mute.
Oh. That's him?
Somebody, there we go. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Bob, sorry, I muted you. Just unmute yourself.
I unmute. Could you talk a little bit about the gnomes? Now, you indicated there were like 42 of them.
42 from the bottom of Egypt to the top. There were 42 gnomes. They're like states. Think of them as states.
Right. So wouldn't you think that there was communication between these states at all?
I would.
Question.
I would think that there would be communication. Why do you ask?
Because why wouldn't they then have indicated a destruction of Tanis at some point as part of one of the gnomes areas?
Maybe. You know, I don't know. Why would they? You know, gee, that's somebody else's problem. It's it's 150 kilometers from here. I don't know that they would have necessarily done it. We do have one papyrus, by the way, which supports the idea that the river turned to blood, etc. There is one piece of evidence along those lines. I think the argument that somebody else should have written it down, I don't know, everybody's concerned with their own local thing. A, B, I don't think anybody's gone through the records of all of these places because I don't think it was particularly interesting to anybody. Keep in mind, and this is a very interesting and important fact when you're dealing with the archaeological record. I should have mentioned this. When you're dealing with the archaeological record in archaeology, keep in mind, they're only looking in the places they're interested in looking. They're not trying to do an exhaustive study of every site, which would be pretty much impossible. That's how many there are in Egypt. Okay, so, I don't know that anybody's researching, what went on in I don't think anybody's necessarily digging up. Let me find the capital city of the 12th nome and dig it up. Why would anybody bother with that? They're much more interested in pyramids and statues and places where the kings were. So the absence of evidence could easily simply be that, listen, nowadays you can go to the library and look up your government records, or you can go on the internet and look up your government records. In those days, the government records are sitting somewhere. They're sitting in some town somewhere. Nobody bothered to dig them up. I don't think that it proves anything. And again, the important thing about keeping in mind that this is how archaeology works is when you're looking for wide scale evidence, but you're only looking in a very limited number of places, chances are you're not going to find that evidence.
It's probably one of the kids.
Mark Pfeffer. There you go.
I'm unmuted. 2 points. Is there any evidence
Put it back on mute.
of any volcanic activity in Egypt? And my second question is, do they have any explanation for how those tremendous pieces of granite could appear in one location and not in another location? They did not have any equipment to move granite of that size.
Well, apparently they did, because, but let me answer your questions in order, which means I have to remember your first question. Oh, volcanic activity. There's no volcanic activity in Egypt. The closest volcanic activity is on the north side of the Mediterranean. I think in the Malta area is the closest. As to the question of moving granite, it's not hard to know where granite originated, what quarry it came out of, because every quarry has a unique signature. They moved, we're not going to get into how they managed this, but they managed to move massive, and I mean, even by today's standards, massive quantities of granite from Aswan all the way up the Nile River, even to Tanis, which is literally 1,000 kilometers. They were able to move huge pieces, huge chunks of granite. How they did that? I mean, Brian Forrester has ideas, but you'll have to check him out. Okay. Judge? Judge, try to unmute there. I invited you to unmute. We'll go to Esther. Let's see if Esther can do it.
Yeah.
Oh, Judge, go ahead.
You mentioned the nearby city of, I believe it's pronounced Avarice.
Yes.
Yeah. Could there not have, that was not destroyed. Could there not have been some records there?
Yeah, it was destroyed after the Hyksos were defeated. It was destroyed, and I believe they tried or did some rebuilding on the site afterwards, but it was destroyed, not in a supernatural way,
Okay.
but it was basically razed to the ground by the Egyptians when they kicked out the Hyksos.
Thank you.
Esther.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, on the side of the various tombs and granite pieces and all that, it seemed like there were hieroglyphics. Is it possible that that was telling a story, or that's just one question. The other thing I wanted to say is my Our youngest son and his family live in Goshen, and there are not too many Jews there, and they're not very well liked or respected up in Orange County.
Gotcha. All right, let me talk about the hieroglyphics. So first of all, we're able to read hieroglyphics. So most of them anyway. So we would know if they were telling the story. It wouldn't be hard to decipher. It's important to also to recognize, though, that very often rulers in Egypt basically put their signature via hieroglyphics, which is how they communicated. They put their signature on things that weren't theirs all the time. They appropriated stuff. And in particular, by the way, in this span of history where the Jews are in Egypt, you see a great deal of appropriating of this guy took, he took their monuments, put his name on it, and then the next guy comes and erases them. As a matter of fact, there are 3 kings from this time period immediately preceding the Exodus that were unknown to history until the middle of the 19th century, because they had basically disappeared from the record because all of their stuff had been appropriated by later kings. All right. We have done our best to explain the story as best as possible. I think that 2 things come out of this. Number 1, a better reading of the story in the text, which is always a good enough goal in its own right. But also, I think that there is clear archaeological evidence of the Exodus, the miraculous destruction of Tanis, and for that matter, the miraculous destruction of the gods, the temples of the gods of the kings of Egypt at that time, points to clearly the story in the Bible and is perfectly consistent with the story in the Bible. And while we have always hear the argument that where is it in the archaeological record, where are the plagues and where is the Exodus, the simple answer is it was a local phenomenon. The place where the records most likely would be was destroyed. If they are somewhere else, they're easily may not have yet been found. And for that matter, we have evidence of, again, divine, there's no other word for it, being able to apply thousands of degrees of Celsius heat to granite in order to slough it off. It's clear that something was going on there that was supernatural. It reads well in the story. It reads consistently with the story. And therefore, I would argue to you that we have a great deal of evidence, indirect and even direct evidence, but we definitely have a great deal of indirect evidence for the Exodus from the archaeological record. It's just a question of looking at it the right way and reading the story properly. And that is my novel, I don't want to say radical, novel approach to the story. And I believe that upon further reflection, you will find that it holds up, I think, very, very well within the text. I would recommend that you take a look and read through Exodus 1 through 12 for sure, or 13, 12 or 13, through the plague of the firstborn. And if you read through the story, I think that you'll see that Moses it certainly sounds like he's dealing with somebody local. Based on the geography, that local person couldn't be the big king. And for that matter, from a theological point of view, it makes a lot more sense to us that those Egyptians that were oppressing the Jews were the ones who were stricken and not literally everybody else. And with that, I will conclude. We'll be back next Tuesday night, subject as yet undetermined. Thank you very much for being with us. We will see you soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Welcome to you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Good night.
Most
Thank you.
Very much.
Bye.